Millionaire saves woman from drunk. Husband, not knowing he would fall in love with her. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Starlight Bar wasn't much to look at, but it was the only place in the small town of Pine Grove where Clara Bennett could make enough tips to keep the lights on. At 35, she had gotten used to the smell of stale beer and the way her feet ached after a double shift. What she couldn't get used to was the way her husband Darren's eyes would glaze over after his fifth drink. Another round, Darren slurred, slamming his empty glass on the counter. Clara winced at the sound, but kept wiping down tables. "I think you've had enough, honey," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. She could feel the other customers watching. They all knew how this usually went. That's when Julian Hart walked in. Nobody recognized him at first. Why would a millionaire developer be at a place like the Starlight? But there he was, in his expensive suit that probably cost more than Clara made in 3 months. He'd come to check on his latest project, a luxury resort that was going to change everything in Pine Grove for better or worse. "I said another round." Darren's voice got louder. Clara's hands started shaking as she carried a tray of empty glasses back to the bar. Julian noticed. He'd been watching since he walked in, the way Clara moved like someone used to dodging bombs, the tired smile she put on for customers, the fear in her eyes when her husband's voice rose. "Sir," Julian spoke up, his deep voice carrying across the bar. "I believe the lady suggested you've had enough." Darren spun around, almost falling off his stool. "Mind your own business, rich boy," he spat out. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Darren lunged forward, grabbing Clara's arm so hard she dropped her tray. The crash of breaking glass filled the bar. Before anyone could react, Julian was there, his hand locked around Darren's wrist. "Let her go." Julian's words came out like ice. "She's my wife." Darren tried to pull away, but Julian's grip was firm. "That's not a license to hurt her." Julian's other hand was already reaching for his phone. "Should I call the police, or would you prefer to leave on your own?" The bar had gone completely silent. Clara stood frozen, her arm already bruising where Darren had grabbed her. She'd never seen anyone stand up to him like this. "This ain't over," Darren snarled, yanking his arm free. He stumbled toward the door, knocking over a chair on his way out. Clara started picking up the broken glass, her hands trembling. Julian knelt down to help her. "You don't have to do that," she mumbled, not meeting his eyes. "I want to," Julian said simply. "I'm Julian Hart. I know who you are. Everyone does." Clara managed a small smile. "I'm Clara Bennett, and thank you. But you shouldn't have gotten involved. He'll just be worse later." Julian's jaw tightened. "You don't have to go home to him." Clara laughed, but there was no joy in it. "It's not that simple." "It could be." Julian pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. "This is my personal number and the address of a women's shelter I work with. They're good people, they can help." Clara took the card, tucking it into her apron pocket. She knew she wouldn't use it, but something about having it made her feel less alone. "Your kindness will get you in trouble, Mr. Hart," she said softly. "Julian," he corrected, "and trouble doesn't scare me." As he walked out of the bar, Julian couldn't shake the image of Clara's tired eyes or the way she'd tried to smile through her fear. He'd built his fortune making the right decisions at the right time, but tonight, walking away from Clara Bennett felt like the wrong decision entirely. Back in his hotel room, Julian stared at his phone. He could have his security team watch her house. He could have Darren arrested. He could, but he knew he couldn't fix this for her. Clara would have to take the first step herself. Still, as he lay in bed that night, all he could think about was the way she'd said his kindness would get him in trouble. Maybe some trouble was worth having. At home, Clara listened to Darren's drunken snoring from the couch where she'd decided to sleep. The business card felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. She took it out, running her fingers over Julian's neat handwriting in the dark. Tomorrow would be another day of pretending everything was fine. But for the first time in years, Clara let herself imagine a different kind of life, one where she didn't have to pretend, one where someone looked at her the way Julian Hart had, like she mattered. She just didn't know if she was brave enough to reach for it. As the night crept on, 2 people lay awake in Pine Grove, a millionaire developer in his luxury hotel suite and a waitress on her worn-out couch. Neither knew it yet, but their lives had changed the moment Julian Hart walked into the Starlight Bar. The next few weeks would test them both in ways they never expected. But that's the thing about fate. It doesn't ask permission before it changes your life. It just walks into a bar one night, wearing an expensive suit and rewrites your whole story. The morning after the incident at the Starlight Bar, Julian couldn't focus on his work. The resort plans sat untouched on his desk while he made phone calls, discreet ones to people who knew how to find information without drawing attention. "I want everything you can find on Darren Bennett," he told his head of security, and his wife, Clara. What he learned made his blood boil. 3 domestic disturbance calls in the past year alone. No charges filed. A restraining order that had been dropped. The familiar pattern of abuse and fear made Julian's hands curl into fists. Meanwhile, Clara showed up for her shift with extra makeup covering the bruise on her arm. She'd barely slept, jumping at every sound in her house, expecting Darren to explode again. But he'd left early, probably to drink away his humiliation at another bar. "You okay, honey?" asked Betty, the other waitress. She was in her 60s and had worked at the Starlight longer than anyone. "We all saw what happened last night." "I'm fine," Clara said automatically. The lie came easily after so many years. The lunch rush had just started when Julian walked in again. This time he wasn't wearing a suit, just jeans and a casual shirt that probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent. He sat in her section, and her heart started beating faster. "Mr. Hart," she said, approaching his table, "I didn't expect to see you again." "Julian," he reminded her, "and I wanted to make sure you were all right." Before Clara could answer, the door banged open. Darren stormed in, reeking of alcohol even though it wasn't even 2 in the afternoon. "So this is why you're working lunch shifts now," he shouted. "Meeting your rich boyfriend?" Clara froze. Julian stood up slowly, positioning himself between her and Darren. "Don't," Clara whispered. "Please, you'll make it worse." But Darren was already throwing punches. Julian blocked the first one easily. Clearly he knew how to handle himself in a fight. What he didn't expect was Darren pulling a knife. "I told you this wasn't over," Darren snarled. Everything happened fast after that. Betty called the police. Julian managed to disarm Darren, but not before getting a cut on his arm. When the police arrived, they had no choice but to arrest Darren. Pulling a knife in public was something they couldn't ignore. As they put Darren in the police car, he kept shouting at Clara, "This is your fault. You'll regret this." Clara was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Julian guided her to a chair, his arm bleeding through his expensive shirt. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for a clean napkin to press against the cut. "It's nothing," Julian assured her, "but you can't go home tonight. He'll make bail soon." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Clara admitted. "Yes, you do." Julian pulled out his phone. "I own a secure apartment building downtown. The penthouse is empty. You'll be safe there." Clara started to protest, but Julian cut her off. "Just for a few days until we figure something out. Please, Clara, don't give him another chance to hurt you." Maybe it was the way he said please, or the blood seeping through his shirt because of her, or just the bone-deep exhaustion of being afraid all the time. Whatever the reason, Clara found herself nodding. "I'll need to get some things from my house," she said quietly. "My security team will go with you." Julian's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not taking any chances." As Clara sat in the back of Julian's luxury car later that day, a small bag of belongings beside her, she felt like she was dreaming. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been trapped in her normal life. Now she was accepting help from a millionaire who'd gotten stabbed trying to protect her. "What do you want from me?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you doing all this?" Julian looked at her through the rearview mirror. "Would you believe me if I said I just want you to be safe?" Clara met his eyes in the mirror. "No one does anything for nothing." "Then believe this. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I have everything except someone to share it with. Everyone I meet wants something from me. But you," he paused, "you keep telling me to stay away for my own good. That's new for me." Clara looked out the window, watching Pine Grove pass by. "This is crazy. I barely know you." "Then let's change that," Julian said simply. "No pressure, no expectations. Just 2 people getting to know each other while you figure out your next step." It should have scared her, how much she wanted to believe him. Instead, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. What she didn't know was that across town, Darren was already making bail, and he wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit, different from Julian's style, sharper and colder, was waiting for him. "Mr. Bennett," the man said smoothly, "I represent someone who shares your concern about Julian Hart. Perhaps we can help each other." Darren's angry eyes lit up with cruel interest. "I'm listening." The penthouse apartment was bigger than Clara's entire house. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Pine Grove, making the small town seem like a collection of toy buildings. Clara stood at the window, hugging herself, while Julian showed her around. The security team is downstairs 24/7, he explained. No one gets up here without clearance. He handed her a key card. This is yours. Use whatever you need. The fridge is stocked. Clara turned to face him. In the soft evening light, she could see the bandage on his arm where Darren had cut him. Why did you really help me, Julian? The truth. Julian was quiet for a moment. 20 years ago, my sister was in a relationship like yours. I was too young to help her. By the time anyone realized how bad it was, he stopped, his jaw tight. Let's just say I don't believe in looking the other way anymore. I'm sorry about your sister, Clara said softly. So am I. Julian checked his phone. I have a meeting I can't miss. Will you be okay here? Clara nodded, even though her heart was racing at the thought of being alone in this strange place. Thank you for everything. After Julian left, Clara explored the apartment. The closets were full of new clothes in her size. The bathroom had every product she could need. He'd thought of everything. It made her uncomfortable, all this luxury, all this thoughtfulness from a stranger. Meanwhile, across town, Darren sat in a fancy office facing the man who'd bailed him out. Richard Kane, the nameplate on his desk read. Julian Hart is becoming a problem, Kane said, sliding a drink across the desk. His resort project is threatening some very important investments in Pine Grove. My clients would be very grateful if the project were to experience delays. What's in it for me? Darren asked, taking the drink. Kane smiled coldly. Besides the considerable financial compensation, you get to make Hart regret ever laying eyes on your wife. Back at the penthouse, Clara couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet. Around midnight, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Miss me, baby? Your boyfriend can't protect you forever. Her hands shaking, Clara called Julian. I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said immediately. When Julian arrived, he found Clara sitting in the dark living room. Without a word, he sat next to her on the couch. Show me, he said quietly. Clara handed him her phone. Julian's face hardened as he read the message. He's not supposed to contact you, Julian said. This violates the restraining order. A restraining order is just a piece of paper, Clara interrupted. It won't stop him. Nothing stops him. I'll stop him. Julian's voice was steel. Clara looked at him then, really looked at him. In the dim light from the windows, she could see the determination in his face, the way his hands were clenched. Why do you care so much? She whispered. Instead of answering, Julian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek. His fingers were gentle against the fading bruise. Because when I look at you, he said softly, I see someone worth fighting for. Clara's heart stuttered. No one had ever looked at her the way Julian was looking at her now, like she was precious, like she mattered. But the moment was broken by Julian's phone ringing. His face changed when he saw the number. I have to take this, he said, standing up. He walked to the window, his voice low and angry. What do you mean the permits were revoked? That's impossible. The council approved everything last month. While Julian dealt with his call, Clara's phone buzzed again. Another message from Darren. Ask your rich boyfriend about Catherine Lewis. Ask him how she died. Clara stared at the message, her blood running cold. Who was Catherine Lewis? And what did Darren know about her? Julian finished his call and came back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Someone's trying to sabotage the resort project. All our permits have been mysteriously revoked. Julian? Clara said carefully. Who is Catherine Lewis? The color drained from Julian's face. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked scared. Where did you hear that name? Darren sent another message. Clara watched Julian's reaction closely. He seems to think her death had something to do with you. Julian sank back onto the couch, suddenly looking much older. Catherine was my wife, he said quietly. She died 5 years ago. There was an accident at one of my construction sites. The investigation cleared me, but the press decided I was responsible, that I'd cut corners on safety to save money, that her death was my fault. Julian's voice was raw with old pain. I loved her, Clara. I would never have done anything to harm her. Clara reached for his hand without thinking. I believe you. Julian squeezed her hand. Darren must have connected with Richard Kane. He's an attorney who represented Catherine's family when they sued me. He's been trying to destroy my business ever since. So this is all connected. Clara felt dizzy. Darren, your resort, Catherine. Kane must have found out about what happened at the bar. He's using Darren to get to me. Julian stood up suddenly. You're not safe here. Kane knows all my properties. We need to move you somewhere else. No, Clara said firmly. I'm tired of running. If Kane wants to use me to hurt you, Let him try. Julian stared at her. Clara, these men are dangerous. So am I, Clara said, surprising herself with her own strength. I've survived Darren for years. I can handle his new friend. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. You're amazing, you know that? For the first time in years, Clara felt something other than fear when she thought about the future. She felt ready to fight. What she didn't know was that across town, Kane was showing Darren photos of the penthouse, of Clara and Julian together. And Darren's eyes were growing darker with each picture. Soon, Kane promised. Very soon. The next morning, Clara woke up to the smell of coffee. She found Julian in the kitchen, looking tired but still impossibly handsome in a fresh suit. You stayed all night? She asked, surprised. On the couch, he assured her. I wanted to make sure you were safe. He slid a cup of coffee across the counter to her, and I had some work to do. The resort situation is worse than I thought. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm mug. Because of Kane. He's turned the town council against me. They're saying the resort will destroy the character of Pine Grove. Julian's laugh was bitter, as if bringing jobs and tourism would be a bad thing. The town could use the money, Clara agreed. The Starlight isn't the only business struggling. Julian looked at her thoughtfully. You know this town better than I do. Would you come to the council meeting with me today? Help me explain why this project matters. Clara hesitated. I don't know anything about real estate, but you know what it's like to live here, to work here. Julian reached for her hand across the counter. Please, Clara, I need your help. The way he said need made her heart skip. Before she could answer, both their phones buzzed. They had the same message, a photo of Catherine Lewis's grave with fresh flowers on it. He's escalating, Julian said grimly. Good, Clara surprised herself by saying. Let him show everyone who he really is. The town council meeting was packed. Clara sat next to Julian, aware of all the whispers and stares. Everyone knew who she was now, the waitress who'd caught the millionaire's eye. Kane was there too, sitting with a group of concerned citizens who all looked too well dressed to be regular Pine Grove folks. And in the back, trying to be inconspicuous, was Darren. When Julian stood to present his plans, Kane's group started their attack. What about the environmental impact? One woman demanded. How can we trust you after what happened to your wife? A man called out. Clara watched Julian maintain his composure, explaining patiently about job creation and economic growth, but she could see him struggling. These people had already decided he was the villain. Before she could stop herself, Clara stood up. I've worked at the Starlight Bar for 12 years, she said, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger. I've watched this town slowly dying. Good people can't find work. Businesses are closing. Mr. Hart's resort could change that, and I'm sure he's compensating you well for your support, Kane said smoothly. Clara felt her face flush, but she didn't back down. I'm not the one being paid to cause trouble, Mr. Kane. How much are you giving my husband to harass us? A murmur went through the crowd. Kane's smile slipped. That's a serious accusation, he said coldly. So is corporate sabotage, Julian added, standing beside Clara. And harassment. And violating a restraining order. He pulled out his phone, showing the messages they'd received. The council members looked uncomfortable. This wasn't going according to Kane's script, but Darren wasn't following the script either. He stood up, drunk and angry. You think you can steal my wife? He shouted at Julian. You think your money makes you better than me? Tell them about Catherine. Tell them how she really died. The room erupted in chaos. Security moved to remove Darren, but he was still shouting. He killed her, and he'll kill Clara too, you'll see. As they dragged Darren out, Kane quietly slipped away. But the damage was done. The council voted to delay their decision on the permits. Back in Julian's car, Clara finally broke down crying. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I made everything worse. Julian pulled her into his arms, not caring who might see them in the parking lot. You were magnificent, he whispered into her hair. So you stood up to them. You stood up for me. Clara pulled back to look at him, suddenly very aware of how close they were. Julian, she whispered. What are we doing? I don't know, he admitted. But I know I can't lose you. Not to Darren, not to Kane, not to anyone. Their faces were inches apart. Clara could feel her heart pounding. Julian's hands were gentle on her face as he slowly leaned in. A rock shattered the car window. They jumped apart as glass rained down. On the windshield was a note. You're both dead. Julian started the car, his hands shaking with anger. That's it. We're leaving Pine Grove. Tonight. Running won't solve anything, Clara protested. It's not running. It's regrouping. Julian pulled out his phone. I have a house in the mountains. Kane doesn't know about it. We'll be safe there while I figure out how to fight back. As they drove back to the penthouse to pack, neither of them noticed the black car following them. In it, Kane was making a call. Change of plans, he said. They're leaving town. Yes, I know where they're going, the Lewis house. Time to finish what we started 5 years ago. In the passenger seat, Darren grinned maliciously. What exactly happened at that house? Kane's smile was cold. Let's just say Catherine's death wasn't as accidental as everyone thinks. And soon, Julian Hart will lose another woman he loves. But Kane didn't know something important. Clara wasn't Catherine. And she wasn't going to be anyone's victim. Not anymore. The drive to Julian's mountain house took 3 hours. Clara watched Pine Grove disappear in the rearview mirror, a mix of relief and anxiety in her stomach. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We'll be there soon, Julian said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. His touch sent warmth through her whole body. The mountain house turned out to be more like a mansion, hidden away in the woods at the end of a long private road. Security cameras watched the entrance, and a tall fence surrounded the property. Catherine and I used to come here to get away from everything, Julian said quietly as they pulled up to the house. I haven't been back since. Clara touched his arm gently. We don't have to stay here if it's too painful. No, Julian shook his head. It's time to face the past. All of it. Inside, the house was beautiful, but felt frozen in time. Photos of Catherine still hung on the walls. A stunning blonde woman with a bright smile, always looking at Julian with such love in her eyes. She was beautiful, Clara said softly. Yes, she was. Julian stared at one of the photos. Kane was her cousin. Did you know that? He never thought I was good enough for her. When she died, his voice broke. He convinced everyone it was my fault. Clara moved closer to him. What really happened that day? Julian turned to face her, his eyes haunted. Catherine loved visiting my construction sites. She was an architect, that's how we met. That day, she was checking the progress on a new office building. The platform she was on collapsed. The investigation showed that someone had tampered with the safety equipment, but they couldn't prove who did it. You think Kane was involved? I could never prove it. But Catherine had found some irregularities in his law firm's accounts. She was going to report him. Julian's hands clenched into fists. A week later, she was dead. Suddenly, Clara understood. And now he's using Darren to get to you, just like he used Catherine's death. I won't let him hurt you, Julian said fiercely. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her face. Clara, A noise from upstairs made them both freeze. I thought you said nobody knew about this place, Clara whispered. Nobody does. Julian was already reaching for his phone. Except Catherine's family, a cold voice finished. Richard Kane stepped out of the shadows at the top of the stairs, holding a gun. Really, Julian? Bringing your new girlfriend to the house where my cousin died? That's just asking for trouble. Darren appeared behind Kane, his eyes wild with drunk anger. Hello, baby. Miss me? Clara felt Julian try to push her behind him, but she stood her ground. How did you find us? Kane smiled. Catherine told me about this place years ago. I've been watching it, waiting for Julian to make a mistake. And here you are. What do you want? Julian demanded. The same thing I wanted 5 years ago. Justice. Kane started walking down the stairs. You destroyed my cousin's life. Now I'm going to destroy yours. You're lying, Clara said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. Catherine was going to expose your illegal activities. You killed her to keep her quiet. Kane's smile faltered for just a second. Careful, Clara. You don't want to end up like her. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Clara continued, her voice getting stronger. The resort project. You're afraid Julian will find what Catherine found. The evidence is still here somewhere in this house, isn't it? Kane's face turned ugly. Darren, shut her up. But Darren was looking confused. What's she talking about? You said we were just going to scare them. Your wife is very clever, Kane said coldly. She's figured it out. Yes, Catherine found proof that I was embezzling from my clients. Millions of dollars. She was going to ruin everything I'd built. I couldn't let that happen. So you killed her. Julian's voice was shaking with rage. Your own cousin, and made everyone think it was your fault, Kane agreed. It was perfect. But Catherine, sentimental fool that she was, kept copies of everything she found, hidden somewhere in this house. That's why I've been watching, waiting for someone to come back here. Clara's mind was racing. Catherine had been an architect. She would have known every inch of this house. The blueprints, she said suddenly. In the photos, Catherine is always standing in front of the same wall. Julian's eyes widened in understanding. He looked at the photo they'd been discussing earlier. Kane raised the gun. "Don't move." But Darren, finally realizing he'd been used, grabbed Kane's arm. "You said nobody would get hurt." The gun went off. The bullet hit the ceiling, sending plaster raining down. In the chaos, Julian tackled Kane while Clara ran for the wall in the photo. She found it, a loose panel, and behind it a safe. "Julian," she called out. What would Catherine use as a code? Julian, still struggling with Kane, shouted back, "Our anniversary, 0714. Clara's fingers flew over the keypad. The safe clicked open. Inside was a USB drive and a stack of documents. Kane's scream of rage told her she'd found exactly what they needed. Darren, for once in his life doing something right, had called the police. Soon, the house was filled with flashing lights and uniformed officers. As they led Kane away in handcuffs, he spat at Julian. "You'll never prove anything." But he was wrong. Catherine had proven everything. The documents showed years of embezzlement, and buried in the files was proof that Kane had paid someone to tamper with the safety equipment that killed her. Darren, looking surprisingly sober, approached Clara. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never knew. I didn't mean—" Clara held up her hand. "Just go, Darren. It's over." Later, as they sat on the front steps of the mountain house, watching the police cars drive away, Julian turned to Clara. "You were incredible," he said softly. "You saved everyone. You saved me." Clara looked at him, this powerful man who looked at her like she was the strong one. "We saved each other." Julian leaned in, and this time there were no interruptions. When his lips met hers, Clara felt like she was finally waking up from a long nightmare. But in the back of the police car, Kane was smiling. Because he knew something they didn't. The real evidence, the proof of his biggest crimes, was still hidden in the mountain house, and he had one last card to play. "Officer," he said smoothly, "I'd like to make a phone call. There's someone who needs to know that Julian Hart has moved on from their daughter." Catherine's parents had never believed Julian was innocent, and they were about to find out that he was already replacing their daughter with a small-town waitress. Kane's smile grew wider. The war wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The morning after Kane's arrest, Clara woke up to the sound of angry voices. She'd fallen asleep on the couch in the mountain house, Julian's jacket draped over her. Now she could hear him arguing with someone at the front door. "How dare you bring her here?" A woman's voice cut through the air like ice. To Catherine's house, Clara sat up just as an elegant older couple pushed past Julian into the living room. The woman stopped short when she saw Clara, her face going pale. "Margaret, Robert," Julian said tiredly, "this isn't what you think. Really." Margaret Lewis, Catherine's mother, looked at Clara with pure disgust. "Because I think you've replaced our daughter with this... Watch your next words very carefully," Julian warned, his voice hard. Clara stood up, smoothing her wrinkled clothes. "I'll make some coffee. We clearly have a lot to talk about." "We have nothing to talk about with you," Robert Lewis snapped. "We came because Richard called us. He told us everything." Julian's face darkened. "Kane is a murderer. He killed your daughter, and now he's trying to manipulate you again." "Richard has been like a son to us," Margaret said. "He would never hurt Catherine. You're the one who cut corners on safety. You're the one who got her killed." "Actually," Clara spoke up, her voice stronger than she felt, "we found proof last night that Kane was behind everything. Catherine had evidence." "Don't you dare speak her name." Margaret's voice shook with rage. "You're nothing but a gold digger taking advantage of Julian's grief." "That's enough," Julian shouted, making everyone jump. "Clara is the reason we finally found the truth about Catherine's death. She figured out where Catherine hid the evidence against Kane. Evidence that proves he had your daughter killed because she discovered he was stealing from his clients." Robert Lewis sank into a chair, looking old and tired. "What evidence?" Julian retrieved the documents from the safe, spreading them out on the coffee table. As Catherine's parents read through the files, their faces went through a range of emotions: shock, denial, grief, and finally, rage. "He lied to us," Margaret whispered. "All these years, Richard lied. He used your grief to turn you against Julian," Clara said gently. "He knew you were hurting and looking for someone to blame." Margaret looked at Clara with different eyes now. "You found this? You solved what happened to our Catherine?" Clara nodded. "She left clues. She was trying to protect Julian, even at the end." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "We've been so wrong, Julian. We've been so terribly wrong." Julian's face softened. "For you were grieving. Kane took advantage of that. But we caused you so much pain, Robert said. We tried to destroy your business, your reputation. None of that matters now, Julian said. What matters is that Catherine's killer will finally face justice. Clara started to slip quietly from the room, feeling like she was intruding on a private moment, but Julian caught her hand. Stay, he said softly. Please. Margaret watched this interaction with fresh eyes. You love her, don't you? Julian looked at Clara, his eyes full of emotion. Yes, I do. Clara's heart skipped a beat. He'd never said it before. Catherine would have liked you, Margaret said suddenly to Clara. She always said Julian needed someone strong enough to stand beside him, not behind him. Before Clara could respond, Julian's phone rang. His face went pale as he listened. What is it? Clara asked when he hung up. Kane escaped custody, Julian said grimly. And he's not alone. Darren's gone too. Margaret gripped her husband's hand. What does that mean? It means they're desperate, Clara said. And desperate men are dangerous. Julian's security team arrived within the hour, sweeping the house and grounds. They found evidence that someone had been living in the old groundskeeper's cottage, watching, waiting. There's something else, Julian told Clara privately. The police found plans in Kane's office, detailed plans of this house, with notes about hidden spaces we haven't found yet. You think there's more evidence. I think Catherine knew more than she had time to document, and I think Kane's been searching for it all these years. Clara looked around the beautiful house that held so many secrets. Then we need to find it first. It's too dangerous, Julian protested. You should go somewhere safe while what? While you face this alone? Clara touched his face gently. I don't run from fights, Julian. You should know that by now. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. I've never known anyone like you. Julian, Margaret called from the living room. There's something you need to see. They hurried back to find Robert and Margaret looking at an old photo album. Look at this picture, Margaret said. Catherine's last birthday here. Look at the bookshelf behind her. In the photo, just visible behind Catherine's smiling face, was a book titled Family Secrets. That book isn't here now, Robert said. We went through everything after she died. Julian and Clara exchanged looks. They had a new clue, but so did Kane. It was a race now to find whatever Catherine had hidden, but as they started their search, none of them noticed the small red light blinking in the corner of the room. In a van parked miles away, Kane and Darren watched them on a laptop screen. Idiots, Kane sneered. They're going to lead us right to it. Darren looked uncertain. And then what? Kane's smile was chilling. And then we burn it all down. With them inside, thunder rolled across the mountains as Clara searched the library for the mysterious book. Rain pounded against the windows, making the huge house feel even more isolated. The power had gone out an hour ago, leaving them working by flashlight. Catherine loved storms, Margaret said, running her hand along the bookshelves. She used to say they made the house feel magical. Clara paused at a shelf that didn't look quite right. Julian, can you help me move this? Together they pulled the heavy bookcase away from the wall. Behind it was a small door, painted to match the wallpaper. I never knew this was here, Julian breathed. Catherine designed this house, Robert reminded them. She probably built in all sorts of hidden spaces. The door opened with a creak, revealing a narrow passage. Clara's flashlight beam showed stairs leading down. A secret basement, Clara whispered. The blueprints never showed this. Julian touched her arm. Let me go first. We'll go together, Clara said firmly. The stairs led to a small room filled with filing cabinets. On a desk in the center sat a leather-bound book titled Family Secrets. This is it, Margaret said, reaching for the book. Wait, Clara grabbed her hand. Look at the floor. Thin wires crisscrossed the room, barely visible in the flashlight beam. Tripwires, Julian said grimly. Kane's been here. He's turned this place into a trap. A loud crash from upstairs made them all jump. Then they heard footsteps. Well, well, Kane's voice echoed down the stairs. The whole family's here. How convenient. Darren appeared in the doorway holding a gun. He looked terrified but determined. Nobody move, Kane said, stepping into view. Catherine's little time capsule has caused enough trouble. It's over, Richard, Margaret said, her voice shaking. We know what you did to our daughter. What I did? Kane laughed. I protected this family. Catherine was going to ruin everything with her stupid moral crusade, just like Julian's little waitress is trying to do now. Clara felt Julian tense beside her, ready to move, but she squeezed his hand in warning. The tripwires were still a threat. You know what's in that book, don't you? Clara asked, keeping Kane talking. Something worse than embezzlement. Something Catherine found out about her own family. Kane's smile faltered. Clever girl, but not clever enough. Catherine had quite a shock when she discovered where the Lewis family fortune really came from. Generations of criminal enterprises, all covered up neat and tidy by the family lawyer, my father, and his father before him. Margaret gasped. What are you talking about? Oh, Aunt Margaret, Kane sneered. So naive. Did you never wonder why your father insisted you marry my uncle? Had to keep it all in the family. The money laundering, the blackmail, the accidents that happened to anyone who got too curious. Catherine was going to expose everything, Clara realized. Not just your crimes, all of it. She thought she was being so careful, Kane said, hiding her evidence, making copies. She didn't realize I was watching her the whole time. When she finally found this room, he gestured with his gun. Well, let's just say the construction site accident was a backup plan. You killed her here? Julian's voice was raw with horror. She died knowing her beloved family was built on blood money, Kane said. Just like you're all going to die tonight. He pulled out a remote control. This whole room is rigged to blow. Catherine's evidence, her secrets, and everyone who knows about them, all gone in one bright flash. Richard, please, Robert begged. We're your family. Family? Kane laughed. Family is just another word for people who can betray you. Catherine taught me that. But while Kane was focused on his monologue, Clara had been watching Darren. She saw the way his hands shook on the gun, the sweat on his face. Darren, she said softly, you don't have to do this. You're not a murderer. Shut up, Kane snapped. Darren, don't listen to her. He's using you, Clara continued, just like he used Catherine's parents, just like he's probably using you right now to take the fall if anything goes wrong. Darren's eyes darted between Clara and Kane. Is that true? Am I just your patsy? Of course not, Kane said smoothly. We're partners. Partners? Clara laughed. Show him what's in your pocket, Kane. The one-way ticket I bet you bought. Were you planning to take Darren with you when you ran? Kane's face twisted with rage. He raised the remote. Enough! Several things happened at once. Darren, realizing Clara was right, turned his gun on Kane. Kane hit the button on the remote, and Julian threw himself at Clara, knocking her clear of the tripwires. The explosion that followed was deafening in the small space. But it wasn't the whole room that blew, just the desk with the book. Kane had rigged it as a distraction. Through the smoke and chaos, Clara saw Kane running up the stairs. Darren lay unconscious from the blast, but everyone else seemed okay. Go! Margaret coughed, helping Robert to his feet. Don't let him escape. Julian and Clara raced up the stairs after Kane. The storm was still raging outside as they chased him through the dark house. They cornered him in Catherine's old studio on the top floor. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating Kane's wild eyes as he backed toward the balcony. It's over, Julian said. No more running. Kane smiled, that same cold smile he'd worn when he talked about Catherine's death. You're right about one thing. No more running. He pulled out another remote, bigger than the first. This one's not just for show. The whole house is wired. Catherine's secrets die with all of us. Clara saw his finger move toward the button. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy brass sculpture from a nearby table and threw it with all her strength. The remote flew from Kane's hand as the sculpture hit his arm. He stumbled backward, off balance. When the next lightning flash came, he was gone. They found him later, broken on the rocks below. The storm had washed away most of the evidence of his explosives, but the police bomb squad still spent hours making sure the house was safe. In the end, they found something Kane had missed, a false bottom in the desk drawer that had survived the small explosion. Inside was a letter from Catherine, dated the day she died. As Julian read it aloud, Clara held his hand, watching the pain and love and grief play across his face. Catherine's last words were full of love for him and a warning about her family's dark legacy. She knew she might not survive exposing the truth, Margaret said quietly. She was so brave. Like her mother, Clara said, squeezing Margaret's hand. But later that night, as the police finally left and the storm began to fade, Clara found Julian standing in Catherine's studio, staring at nothing. I always thought finding her killer would bring peace, he said, when Clara wrapped her arms around him from behind. But her own family. She died trying to right those wrongs, Clara reminded him. And she succeeded. The truth is out now. Julian turned to face her. I couldn't bear it if I lost you too. You won't, Clara promised. I'm not going anywhere. But even as she said it, she saw a shadow move in the garden below. Darren had disappeared in the chaos after the explosion, and Clara knew her ex-husband well enough to know he wouldn't stay gone for long. The truth about Catherine's death might have been revealed, But Clara's own story wasn't over yet, and somewhere in the darkness, Darren was watching, waiting for his chance to write the ending. 1 month after Kane's death, life had started to feel almost normal. Clara moved into the mountain house permanently. Julian said it was for safety, but they both knew it was more than that. Margaret and Robert visited often, treating Clara like the daughter they'd lost. The old house that had held so many dark secrets was finally filling with light and love again. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. "How you're jumping at shadows," Julian said one evening as they sat on the porch, but she saw the way his eyes scanned the tree line, the way his security team had doubled their patrols. "Darren's out there," Clara said quietly. "He won't let this go." As if her words had summoned him, Clara's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Missing the starlight, baby. Bet you never thought you'd end up in a place like this. But everything comes with a price." Julian read the message over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "We'll trace it." "Don't bother," Clara said. "He's using burner phones. He's not as stupid as everyone thinks." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She wandered the house, touching the walls that Catherine had designed, wondering if the dead woman's spirit still lingered here. In Catherine's studio, now Clara's favorite room, she found Julian staring at an old photo. "I've been thinking," he said without turning around. "Maybe we should leave, start fresh somewhere else." "Run away, you mean?" Clara moved to stand beside him. "That's not like you. I've already lost one woman I love in this house." His voice was rough with emotion. "I can't lose another." Clara took the photo from his hands. It showed Catherine on their wedding day, radiant in white. Catherine didn't die because of this house. She died because she was brave enough to stand up to evil. I won't dishonor her memory by running away. Julian pulled Clara into his arms. "When did you get so wise?" "Around the same time I fell in love with you," she whispered. Their quiet moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass downstairs. Julian's phone buzzed immediately. The security system had been breached. "Stay here," Julian ordered, heading for the door. "Not a chance," Clara replied, following him. They found the security team already sweeping the first floor. A rock had been thrown through the kitchen window, with a note wrapped around it. Clara's hands shook as she read it. "Remember our wedding vows, Clara. Till death do us part." "The cameras caught someone running into the woods," the head of security reported. "We're tracking them now." But Clara knew they wouldn't find anything. This was just Darren's way of saying he could get to them anytime he wanted. The next morning, Margaret and Robert arrived early, looking worried. "We just heard from the police," Margaret said. "They found evidence that Darren's been staying at Kane's old hunting cabin, but there's more." Robert handed Julian a stack of papers. These were in Kane's office. He'd been paying Darren for months before the confrontation at the bar. This whole thing, it wasn't random. They chose Clara specifically. "What do you mean?" Clara felt cold despite the warm morning. "Kane had been investigating Julian's life, looking for a weakness," Robert explained. "When he found out about the problems in your marriage, he saw an opportunity. He paid Darren to create scenes at the bar, knowing Julian wouldn't be able to ignore someone in trouble." "I was bait," Clara whispered. "This whole time—" "No," Julian said firmly. "Kane might have orchestrated our meeting, but everything that happened after was real. He couldn't have planned for you to be so brave, so brilliant." "Julian's right," Margaret touched Clara's hand. "You found Catherine's evidence despite Kane's plans, not because of them. You gave us the truth when he wanted to bury it forever." But Clara barely heard them. She was remembering every interaction with Darren over the years, seeing them in a new light. How many of their fights had been genuine, and how many had been performances for Kane's benefit? "I need some air," she said abruptly, heading for the garden. The morning was beautiful, the mountain air crisp and clean. Clara walked to the rose garden Catherine had planted, now carefully tended by Margaret. It was her favorite place to think. She felt Julian's presence before she heard him. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly. "I feel so stupid," Clara admitted. "I never suspected. Because you're a good person who doesn't look for schemes and plots in every interaction." Julian wrapped his arms around her from behind. "That's one of the things I love about you. But that's just it." Clara turned to face him. "Everything that brought us together was based on a lie. How can you trust anything that came after?" "Because I know what real love feels like," Julian said. "What Catherine and I had was real. What you and I have is real. Kane might have orchestrated our meeting, but he didn't orchestrate our feelings." Before Clara could respond, a gunshot rang out. Julian jerked forward with a grunt of pain, red blooming across his shoulder. "Get down!" Clara pulled him behind a stone planter as another shot hit the ground where they'd been standing. How touching, Darren's voice carried across the garden. He emerged from behind a tree, gun trained on them. Really, Julian, you should thank me. If I hadn't played my part so well, you'd never have met your true love. It was all an act, Clara called out, pressing her hand against Julian's wound. Every moment of our marriage? Not all of it, Darren said, moving closer. The drinking was real. The anger was real, but Kane paid me to make sure you stayed scared, stayed vulnerable. Perfect timing, really. I was about to leave you anyway. This way, I got paid to be a bastard. Clara felt something snap inside her. Years of fear turned to rage in an instant. So what's the plan now, she demanded, subtly reaching for the garden shears lying nearby. Kill us both? Finish what Kane started? Just him, Darren said, gesturing at Julian with the gun. You're coming with me. Kane set up accounts overseas, enough money to disappear forever, but I want company. Never going to happen, Clara said calmly. Darren laughed. You don't have a choice, baby. Kane might have been the brains, but I was always going to write the ending my way. That's where you're wrong, Clara said. I'm writing my own ending. She threw the garden shears with all her strength. They caught Darren in the shoulder, making him drop the gun. Clara was on him before he could recover. Years of pent-up fear and rage behind her punch. The security team found them like that. Clara standing over an unconscious Darren, Julian already on the phone calling the police. Later in the hospital where Julian was getting his shoulder treated, Clara finally broke down. I could have killed him, she sobbed. I wanted to, but you didn't, Julian said, pulling her close with his good arm. You stopped. That's what matters. As the police led Darren away in handcuffs, he called out one last time, It was worth it, Clara. Every moment with you was worth it. Clara didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her story wasn't defined by Darren anymore, or by Kane's schemes. She was writing her own chapters now, but in Kane's old office a letter was about to be delivered, one he'd written before his death, addressed to someone who had every reason to hate Julian Hart. Someone who would be very interested to learn about Julian's new love. Catherine's sister was coming home. Victoria Lewis hadn't set foot in Pine Grove for 5 years, not since her sister's funeral. She'd been traveling the world, she told everyone, but really she'd been running from the pain. Now holding Kane's letter in her manicured hands, she felt that old anger burning again. Ms. Lewis? The pilot of her private jet appeared. We're landing in 10 minutes. Victoria nodded, looking out at the familiar mountains. She was nothing like her sweet, trusting sister. Catherine had seen the good in everyone. Victoria saw the truth. At the mountain house, Clara was helping Julian with his physical therapy exercises for his injured shoulder when Margaret burst in. Victoria's back, she said, face pale. She just called. Julian's face went blank, the way it did when he was hiding strong emotions. Why now? Kane sent her a letter before he died, Margaret explained. She says she has new information about Catherine's death. Clara watched Julian carefully. Do you think she really knows something? Victoria always knows something, Julian said grimly. She's been investigating Catherine's death for years. She never believed the official story, even when everyone was blaming me. An hour later, Victoria swept into the house like a storm in designer clothes. She was Catherine's opposite in every way. Dark where Catherine was fair, sharp where Catherine was soft, but she had the same intense blue eyes. Hello, darling, she said to Julian, air-kissing his cheek. I see you've been playing house while I was away. Her eyes raked over Clara, taking in every detail. And this must be the waitress I've heard so much about. Victoria, Margaret warned. Be nice. Oh, I'm always nice. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I just find it interesting that while I've been searching for Catherine's killer, Julian's been falling in love with someone new, someone Kane led right to his door. We know about Kane's plan, Clara said calmly. He's dead now, and Darren's in jail. Yes, very convenient. Victoria pulled an envelope from her bag. But Kane sent me this before he died. Want to know what it says? Without waiting for an answer, she started reading. My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, I'm dead, but I've fulfilled my promise to find out what really happened to Catherine. The truth will shock you. It involves not just me, but the entire Lewis family, and Julian's new love interest is the key to everything. Kane was a liar, Julian snapped. He killed Catherine. We found proof. Did you? Victoria raised a perfect eyebrow. Or did you find what he wanted you to find? Because, according to this letter, Clara isn't just some random waitress Kane chose for his scheme. She has a connection to all of this, one even she doesn't know about. Clara felt cold. What are you talking about? Victoria pulled more papers from her bag. I did some digging after I got Kane's letter. Clara Bennett isn't your real name, is it? You changed it when you turned 18. Your birth name was Clara Thompson. The room went silent. Julian stared at Clara. Thompson? It's a common name, Clara said, but her voice shook. Not in Pine Grove, Victoria said. 25 years ago, there was only one Thompson family here. They owned the construction company that later became Hart Industries when Julian's father bought them out after the accident. Clara sat down hard. What accident? The one that killed your parents, Victoria said softly. The one that Catherine was investigating before she died. She found something in the old Thompson Company records, something about unsafe working conditions, covered-up deaths, including the so-called accident that made a 10-year-old Clara an orphan. Clara's head was spinning. That's impossible. My parents died in a car crash. That's what everyone was told. Victoria handed her a yellowed newspaper clipping. But Catherine found evidence that they were actually killed because they were going to expose safety violations at the construction company. Violations that continued after Hart Industries took over. Stop it, Julian said harshly. My father would never. Your father built his empire on blood money, Victoria cut him off, just like the Lewis family. And Catherine died trying to expose it all. Kane didn't kill her alone. He had help from someone in Hart Industries, someone who's been covering up deaths for 30 years. Clara looked at the newspaper clipping, at the photo of her parents, at her own young face. Memories started flooding back, memories she'd buried long ago. The men in suits at the funeral, the way her aunt had rushed her away from Pine Grove, changed her name, never spoke of the past. Julian, she whispered, did you know? Of course not, he said immediately, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, of fear. The construction site where Catherine died, Victoria pressed on. It was the same site where Clara's parents were killed, 20 years earlier. Kane didn't choose Clara randomly. He chose her because Catherine had already figured it out. The connection between the Thompsons, the Harts, and all the other accidents over the years. Why are you doing this? Margaret demanded. Because Catherine deserves justice, Victoria said. Real justice. Not just Kane taking the fall. We need to know who else was involved. Clara stood up shakily. I need some air. Clara, wait. Julian reached for her, but she pulled away. Outside, the mountain air couldn't clear her head. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her past, about Julian. It was all tangled up in lies and death. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, expecting Julian. But it was Victoria. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Victoria said quietly. Catherine liked you. In her last diary entry, she wrote about seeing a little girl at her father's funeral, about wanting to help her. That was you, Clara. Why didn't she ever tell me? She died before she could. Victoria touched Clara's arm gently. Help me finish what she started. Help me find out who really gave the orders that killed your parents, and my sister. Clara looked back at the house where Julian stood at the window watching them. She loved him. But now she had to wonder, was that love real? Or was it built on a foundation of lies? In his office across town, Julian's father was just opening his mail. Inside was a copy of Kane's letter to Victoria and a note. Should I tell them about the money, or will you? The old man reached for his phone with shaking hands. Some secrets, he decided, needed to stay buried, no matter the cost. But he didn't know what Catherine had known, that the truth always finds its way into the light. And Clara Thompson was about to discover just how deep the darkness went. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain house as Clara packed her bags. After Victoria's revelations, she couldn't stay here, not until she knew the truth. You don't have to leave, Julian said from the doorway. He looked like he hadn't slept. Yes, I do. Clara folded another shirt. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about us, it's all tangled up in lies. Not everything. Julian moved into the room. What I feel for you is real. Is it? Clara turned to face him. Or am I just Catherine's replacement, the next innocent woman for the great Julian Hart to save? Before he could answer, Victoria burst in. Julian, your father's here. Edward Hart was an imposing man even at 70. He filled the doorway with his presence, his expensive suit a armor of wealth and power. Son, he nodded to Julian. Then his eyes fixed on Clara. Miss Thompson, I've been expecting this day for a long time. You knew who I was, Clara said. It wasn't a question. Of course I knew. I've had people watching you since you left Pine Grove. Edward moved to the window. Your parents were good people. Too good. They didn't understand that sometimes sacrifices have to be made for progress. Sacrifices? Clara's voice shook. They were murdered. They were going to expose safety violations that would have bankrupted the company, Edward said calmly. Thousands of jobs would have been lost. Sometimes the few must suffer for the good of the many. Julian stared at his father in horror. You knew about this? All these years? I knew everything. Edward turned to face them, including what really happened to Catherine. Victoria, who had been quietly recording the conversation on her phone, stepped forward. Tell us. Catherine found the old Thompson files, Edward sighed. She confronted Kane about it, threatened to expose everything. He came to me for help. I told him to handle it. You ordered my sister's death. Victoria's voice was ice. I gave Kane permission to protect the company by any means necessary, Edward said. I never thought he'd go that far. When I found out what he'd done, I made sure the investigation blamed faulty equipment. To protect Julian, you understand. To protect the family name. To protect yourself, Julian snarled. Everything I did for you, Edward insisted. To build something you could be proud of. Proud of? Julian laughed bitterly. You built an empire on murder and lies. You had Clara's parents killed. You let Kane murder my wife, and then you covered it all up and let me believe. He stopped, realization dawning. The nightmares. Catherine's last words about checking the equipment. She wasn't just being careful, was she? She knew someone was trying to kill her. She left me a note, Clara said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. The day before she died, Victoria found it in Kane's papers and gave it to me last night. She pulled out a worn envelope. She wrote that if anything happened to her, I should look in the old Thompson company safe. She'd found something there, something about my parents, about all the other deaths over the years. Edward's face went pale. That safe was destroyed in the merger. No, Clara smiled grimly. It wasn't. My father built that safe, Mr. Hart. It's still there, hidden in the old factory walls, and I know the combination. It's too late, Edward said. Whatever's in that safe, it's ancient history. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to murder, Victoria finished. She held up her phone. And we have your confession. Edward moved faster than anyone expected, pulling a gun from his jacket. I won't let you destroy everything I've built. Father, Julian said softly, put the gun down. I did it all for you. Edward's hand shook. Everything was for you. No, Julian moved slowly toward him. You did it for yourself, for power, for money. Catherine died because of your greed. Clara lost her parents because of your ambition. And now history repeats itself. Edward turned the gun toward Clara. Another innocent woman, threatening everything I've built. Maybe Kane had the right idea. Some problems can only be solved one way. Several things happened at once. Julian lunged for his father. Victoria screamed, and Clara Thompson, who had spent 20 years running from her past, stood her ground. Pull the trigger, she said calmly. Show everyone exactly who you are. Edward's hand wavered. In that moment of hesitation, Julian knocked the gun away. Security burst in, alerted by Victoria's scream. As they led Edward away in handcuffs, he kept looking back at his son. Julian, please. Everything I did was for you. No, father, Julian said quietly. Everything you did was for your legacy. But here's the thing about legacies. Sometimes they have to burn so something better can grow from the ashes. Later, after the police had gone and the story had exploded across the news, Clara stood in Catherine's studio watching the sunset. Victoria found her there. The contents of the safe will be enough to convict him, she said. For Catherine's death, your parents, all of it, it's over. Is it? Clara asked. Sometimes I feel like I'm still that 10-year-old girl, watching them lower my parents into the ground. You're not alone anymore, Julian said from the doorway. He looked exhausted, but determined. If you'll have me, Clara turned to face him. Your father is not me, Julian said firmly. I love you, Clara Thompson, not because of who you were or what happened to your parents, not because of Catherine or Kane's schemes. I love you because you're the strongest, bravest person I've ever known. Victoria watched them with tears in her eyes. Catherine would have loved this, you know. Her last diary entry, she wrote about hoping you'd find happiness again, Julian. Real happiness. Clara looked at the woman she'd become, at the man who loved her, at the sister of the woman who'd tried to save her so long ago. Perhaps this was what Catherine had wanted all along. Not just justice, but healing. So what now? Victoria asked. Clara took Julian's hand. Now we build something new, something honest. Together. Julian squeezed her hand. I like the sound of that. As they stood together, watching the sun set over the mountains, Clara thought about paths and choices, about love and redemption. Edward Hart had built his empire on secrets and lies, but Clara and Julian would build their future on truth. The mountain house had seen so much darkness: Catherine's murder, Kane's schemes, Edward's confession. But as Clara looked at Julian, at their joined hands, she knew it would see light again. Outside, the roses Catherine had planted were blooming, their sweet scent carrying on the evening breeze. Life went on, love endured, and sometimes, if you were brave enough to face the past, you found your way to a future you never imagined possible. "I love you too," Clara whispered to Julian. "Past, present, and whatever comes next." Victoria smiled, seeing her sister's spirit in the way the last sunlight filled the studio with golden light. Catherine would have loved this ending, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And in the end, that's what love is. Not perfect, not easy, but real. As real as the mountains that had watched over their story. As real as the truth that had finally come to light. The end.